of our lives. For example, fair working conditions, reconciling of personal and professional life, and making sure that we have solid public services. We need to be able to have a real approach, ensuring that women join the workforce, as well as having within the context of digital transformation, artificial intelligence has the potential to improve gender relations. We call for concrete measures to promote equal participation of all genders in the design, implementation, and evaluation of AI-powered technologies. In this context, we have to address the problem of bias data sets and algorithms in AI. And so in a few words, if we have amplification of sexism and gender discrimination in AI, that will just be compounded. We need equal inclusion of all genders at all stages of AI development, and that should result in policies and technologies that make digital equality a true reality and not just a state of objective. Algorithm bias always reflects the values of those people who are providing these algorithms. Therefore, gender-aware coding in AI that serves all and does not reproduce stereotypes and inequalities are absolutely essential. So to a certain extent, AI is really a mirror of the society that we have established, and that mirror shows precisely what we need to correct. Making sure that we have gender equality in all aspects of AI, and that should be a policy, making sure that gender equality is not just an objective, but actually a veritable reality. And that is why it is essential for coding with a gender equality in mind serves all and does not reproduce any stereotypes or inequalities. UNESCO has recommendations for AI and gender equality and using, for example, voice assistants. Now, if you've noticed, they're almost always women, Alexa, Siri, to show that those teams that are developing these technologies for AI, they need to keep in mind a gender balance. So, because if it came to their mind that assistants are women, then that is a case in point. Therefore, we have to continue to incorporate gender equality in these policies areas, mainstreaming it. Now, we believe that there are some 8 million ICT specialists in the EU, but only 17% of them are actually women. Throughout the world, only 22% of AI professionals are women. Essentially, what we can say is that women are underrepresented at all levels in the digital sector in Europe, beginning at with the number of students and the top academic positions. And Gender Equality Index shows that continuous inequalities with only marginal progress is taking place. And what is totally unacceptable is that women in ICT earn almost 20% less than their male colleagues. So closing that gender gap in AI has to begin with training in the digital aspect with a view to gender equality and making sure that girls and women are included in science, technology, engineering, arts, math via public policy and tangible public policy decisions. Moreover, we have to make sure that increasingly women are included in society and of today and of the future. So this is a plea to make sure that gender equality is included in all education policy campaigns within the EU that are targeted at girls and women, to make sure that we have an uptick in AI and digital literacy. One last thing. Now, there's a serious problem, and that is sexist hate speech, misogyny, and online violence against women. We condemn all forms of gender-based violence in the public and private spheres, including on social media, wherever it may take place. This must be stopped, and we call for policies and programs to tackle violence in the digital space against women. Guests, participants, it is clear that we need to have a cross-cutting solution. There isn't one solution to every single AI technology. Therefore, I wish you the best in your work with much enthusiasm, and I wish you all of the success to make sure that we can have a full gender equality also in AI-powered technology policy and digital transformation. And I'd like to wish Ivan and Maria and Manuel the best. And they're here with throughout the course of the day, and I'd like to thank them for their commitment in this specific area. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful event.
Gracias, Irache.
Thank you, Irache.
Our group leader. It's quite curious because I was involved in these debates, in these discussions about artificial intelligence, but I've ever realized about these feminine assistants. That is quite curious and so significant from my perspective. That is absolutely true, the thing that Irache raised. Thank you for introducing this topic and opening the discussion. As you were saying, you were saying, there is persistent gender divide in the digital sector, and the gap is largest in ICT specialists' skills and employment. Closing the gender gap and ensuring that all women can access digital literacy and exercise their digital rights is of paramount importance. We need women to be actors in the digital transition. The evolution of the digital sector must go hand in hand with other aspects such as education, fair working conditions, work-life balance, democracy, good governance, and strong public services. We need real equality and fair jobs. This is the last of the webinar series under the AIDA Special Committee. It's a pity, but it's the last one. Throughout the series, we have discussed and analyzed specific aspects of the future development and deployment of AI in Europe in order to democratize its use, availability, and service to citizens. We have explored as well how the democratization of AI can empower citizens and businesses to bridge the digital divide and make AI a tool for the advancement of freedom, democracy, equality, and prosperity. We have analyzed the impact of AI systems on the labor market as they pose risks to the fundamental rights of employees. Finally, we have also assessed that citizens with a high level of overall digital literacy are the best guarantee of a democratic oversight over AI technologies, which in turn should be understandable to all. In all the webinars we have organized related to labor literacy or diversity, we have included a gender perspective. However, it is important to dedicate our last webinar to gender equality because all breaches need to be closed, but gender equality needs to be ensured rooted in AI development to allow more women to participate in the digital transition. After more than 1 year of work, the AIDA report that will be voted in the next plenary in May has included some aspects of our vision for a democratic AI. We want a democratic AI in Europe which will be humanistic and oriented to serve citizens and society as a whole. Democratic AI that must respect the Charter of Fundamental Rights, ethical principles, legal safeguards, liability, and human oversight. It must be based on principles of non-discrimination, protection of privacy and personal data, transparency, trustworthiness, safety, accessibility, sustainability, and accountability. By being socially responsible, democratic AI must contribute to further advancing the European values of freedom, democracy, and equality, including gender equality. It's the most important branch of the question of the equality from my perspective and, of course, for the perspective of our group. We have reflected this line of thought in our proposed amendments to the AI Act already in negotiation in the Parliament, for example, by adding articles on trustworthy AI where we claim that all systems must be developed, deployed and used in full respect of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and in a lawful, fair, and transparent manner that guarantees privacy and does not discriminate against persons. This obligation also includes the necessary respect to gender equality. And on AI literacy, where we want the Union and Member States to promote AI literacy across the population while ensuring a proper gender balance. We call to invest in targeted upskilling and educational measures to close the digital gender gaps and to foster a gender equal culture and working conditions in this regard. In conclusion, the democratization of technology has the potential to reduce inequalities in society. This has the contrary, has a chance even for the worst. So we have to take notice on this point and take care, of course, of this possible deviation. AI has the potential to sharp gender relation when gender-aware coding that does not reproduce stereotypes and inequalities. It is essential to avoid sexism and discrimination by biased data sets, models, and algorithms in AI. And I will now introduce the speakers, the outstanding panel of speakers that we have today. And thank you very much to all of them for being part of this our last webinar. And the system of the webinar will be the same that it was in the past. Every of the addresses made by our speakers will be followed by the possibility to ask questions, to raise suggestions, to raise comments about every of the topics. I'm going directly to give the floor to our next speaker, that is Ms. Kalyan Skill. Ms. Kalyan Skill is director of the European Institute for Gender Equality. This is the only agency of the Union providing data and analysis on the position of women in all fields, and also with regards to the digital agenda. At AG's helm since February 2020, she oversees the Institute's strategic programs of activities and budgets. Ms. Skill aims to cement AG's position and the EU's knowledge centre on gender equality and deepen collaboration within and beyond Europe. Before taking up her post at EG, Mrs. Skill worked as a Senior Gender Equality Advisor, Senior Human Resources Advisor in the Council of Europe, seconded from the Dutch government. Previously, she worked as the Director for Gender and LGBT Equality for the Dutch government, where she coordinated the national gender and LGBT equality policies. Thank you, Ms. Skill, and my apologies in advance for the pronunciation of your surname, because I'm totally sure that I mislaid it. So thank you very much. You have the floor for now.
Thank you, Chair. And no problem. Most people pronounce my name in a different way, but it's fine. Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for the invite. Artificial intelligence has permeated almost all aspects of our lives. And this is just the beginning. While it may seem that AI and gender equality are not related, they are actually intimately intertwined. The future of AI is female, a future which will be devoid of unconscious bias, a future where all voices are heard equally. In this speech, I will explore what the future of AI looks like for gender equality in the workplace and beyond. Did you like that introduction? I had AI write it. The fact that most of you may not have noticed shows how far artificial intelligence has come in the last years. It was right about a few things. Artificial intelligence and gender equality are intimately intertwined. And this is because AI is a human creation, and humans are not perfect. Let me walk you through some of these imperfections. They start before AI is even developed. Women are less likely to pursue science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at school. They are often deterred by gender stereotypes. The women who do make it to university face further gender segregation in male-dominated fields. On graduation, some of these women will enter the field of AI. Here they can face challenges such as male-dominated work environments, stereotyping, sexual harassment, and a lack of access to funding. Is anyone surprised that only 16% of high-skilled AI workers are women? Some of you may think, well, so what? Women and men choose different career paths, and it's not for us to try to control this. Yet, the low numbers of women in AI are a symptom of a larger problem, and that problem is representation. Representation is key to ensuring fair, equal, and democratic artificial intelligence. Until AI systems reflect our society in all its diversity, AI will cause more problems than it solves. Because when we fail to account for gender, public spaces become male spaces by default. Without representation, exclusively male experiences shape our modern reality. And as we have seen throughout history, those kinds of systems do not tend to work so well for women. Without representation, women miss out on well-paid and respected jobs in a growing industry. Professional sectors dominated by men have long had some of the best conditions in the labor market, and this includes the AI sector. Without representation, biased data sets used to train algorithms perpetuate stereotypes about gender. Let me put this into context for you. A company trains an AI system to help with hiring. They train it using the CVs of existing employees. This makes sense so far. However, this company is male-dominated. Their CVs do not tend to have gaps for maternity leave. Their CVs do not mention being a member of a women's sports club. In fact, their CVs may not include the word woman at all. This lack of representation leads the system to penalize any CV that does not fit this restricted profile. Unless we incentivize representation in industry and academia to increase the diversity of the AI workforce, design bias will continue to reproduce these gender stereotypes, as well as stereotypes about others not represented in the AI workforce, such as people of color. This is why I'm happy that the European Commission is taking action with its proposed Artificial Intelligence Act, which shows promise in minimizing the risk of bias and discrimination in AI. I also welcome the Commission's commitment to train more women and people from diverse backgrounds to become AI professionals. And here I would like to highlight the good work being done by the people behind initiatives such as Women in AI, who are helping propel more women into this sector and who we must listen to and support as much as possible. But there are also women who do not work in the sector themselves, but whose work is nonetheless affected by AI. I will take the example of work organized through platforms, or gig work, as it is often known. This growing sector includes food delivery and ride-hailing services, such as Uber. 28 million Europeans have already done work via such platforms. At AIDA, we interviewed some 5,000 of these workers to understand their motivations and the challenges they face. We found out that they are mainly young, highly educated, and taking care of children, in particular if they are women. Indeed, more than a third of women doing platform work told us they do it because they can combine these jobs with family commitments and housework. Yet, algorithmic scheduling monitors platform workers and can deduct low productivity time from paid work time, leaving platform workers vulnerable to this digital wage theft. A quarter of women platform workers are rarely able to work fixed schedules or plan when and how much they will work. This kind of software poses a particular threat to those caring for small children. EU regulation is often out of step with technological developments. Policy frameworks must become future-proofed to respond to the challenges of new digital technologies. If we do it right, there's much potential in these new areas of artificial intelligence. For example, we found that in online platform work, there is a higher share of men doing jobs usually done by women than there is in the traditional labor market. This includes housework, childcare, and data entry. Having more men being paid to take care of children and people's homes can help chip away at stereotypes about women's and men's work and of how much it is valued. Without mainstreaming gender into all policy related to AI transformation of the labor market, we will lose these critical opportunities to advance gender equality. I will leave you with a thought. One of the very first representations of artificial intelligence came from a woman. When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818, who could have predicted that her story of a human-made creature would remain relevant in 2022? Frankenstein's creation learned how to live from human input, watching a family through a hole in a cottage wall. Frankenstein's creation was an empty shell. It learned its behavior from humans. Mary Shelley showed us that Frankenstein's creature itself was not monstrous, only the humans it observed. 200 years later, is the design of artificial intelligence much different to Mary Shelley's conception? The success of artificial intelligence hinges upon how humans design, program, and use it. And without greater representation, AI has the potential to hinder the fight for gender equality. The gender perspective must be mainstreamed throughout all stages of AI design. AI will then be able to offer an opportunity for us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Skill. Happened to be that Frankenstein is one of my favorite novels from all time. I love it from many perspectives. I think that is evidently a novel advanced in its time and of high actuality in this moment. It's a high current novel and high current theme. It's the time to have the possibility to raise questions to the first speaker. So if is there any of our participants that would like to make it, this is the time. If not, there's another possibility, because many times our participants don't realize that they have the possibility as well to speak each other. So for the rest of the speakers, don't hesitate to ask some questions if you like. This is the moment. I don't see for the moment any question at our screen, so I have one of my own. So I'm going to make it just to break the silence. And for me, it's a question quite curious and quite interesting. Regarding the problem of biased data sets and algorithms, We all agree that a substantial increase in women coders, developers, and decision makers is needed. That is clear. However, when it comes to strategies to avoid the incorrect interpretation of system outputs, we must bear in mind that women are not de facto gender experts. So the sole action of fostering the involvement of women in tech may not be enough to end with gender bias. Do you have any recommendations on how to approach to this matter?
Yes, relevant question. When we talk about representation, the fact that, for example, there is, representation is important. I stress this because we live in a society where we have 50% women, 50% men, more or less. So it's weird to be in surroundings, I think, where we only see one sex represented and the other almost lacking and absent. But the mere fact that there is an equal representation doesn't necessarily mean that there is gender sensitivity, and I think this is what you're hinting at. The fact that we have 50% of women in, let's say, in a meeting doesn't necessarily mean that there is gender sensitive discussions. I know women who are not gender sensitive at all, and I know many men who are gender sensitive. So, but what I'm convinced of, and what we also found through research, it really makes a difference if you have both sexes represented, because there's different input from men and women, and it really makes a difference for discussions. It makes a difference in work as such. You simply have a different input from men and women. So having both sexes present also in this sector, we are fully convinced that it makes a difference. Maybe I can leave it to that. It's an important topic that you touch upon, but I'm also fully convinced that having both sexes represented equally, most preferably, it makes a difference in the work sphere and also in the input that people are giving to their work. Thank you.
Maria, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. I would like to know from your experience in European Institute for Gender Equality, if you know use cases, good practices to illustrate how artificial intelligence technologies, different ones, can help or can contribute or can impact positively gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, again, a very relevant aspect. I must say that I started exploring this topic, let's say the relationship between gender equality and artificial intelligence, let's say recently. Last year we published a report on gender and artificial intelligence that I would like to invite you to have a look at. I cannot mention from my memory at the moment any practices as such. But if possible, I could also come back to you at a later stage with some written responses, if that would help. And again, thank you for the question. It's relevant. And please, if you find the time, you could consult AIGA's website, where you find the report that we published last year.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for your answer and the next information you can provide me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Skill. I don't know if is there anyone else that would like to take the floor to ask some question. If not, I'm going to pass the floor directly to Ms. Sofia Teixeira. She's a professor at the Faculty of Science of the University of Lisbon and Secretary General of the Women in Network Science Society. Currently, she is an assistant professor and researcher at the La Sige and Faculdade de Ciencias Universidade de Lisboa, where she teaches courses as artificial intelligence and machine learning. Previously, she was a data scientist working at Hospital da Luz, learning health. Before that, she did a postdoc at the Indiana University Network Science Institute. Sophia's research interests include modeling and analyzing complex systems through the development of new algorithms on graphs and the application of network science and machine learning methods. Thank you very much, Ms. Teixeira, for being here. Estamos muito gratos pela sua participação. I did it properly. Muito bem, no? Perfect. So, Ms. Teixeira, you have the floor.
And first of all, of course, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here talking about some very important topic that actually it's even more important that we also talk about this in our schools, in our universities. And since we were also talking about some literature references, and I think that actually we can start also there to also educate our children, our teenagers, and obviously then our students in later education. I wanted to leave a reference, this book, Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, in which actually from the beginning of the book, she talks about gender gap. So even before we talk about gender equality, we need to be aware about this gender gap in data and how, and I think that one of the things that I would like to stress is that we are talking about gender equality in AI and how, of course, the data that we feed our algorithms and how we apply them, the outcomes that they provide and so on, are impact, of course, of the quality, the diversity of this data. And if we think about even when we were children and so on, when we start studying in our textbooks, in the cartoons that we watch, we have a very dominant male language. So even the examples that we have in the textbooks to start learning our mother language, our math, and so on, we have a lot of male examples in our sentences. And so there is like this structural embedded lack of gender equality and diversity even from the beginning. So when we are children, we are not completely aware that this is actually an issue and how that may impact our cognitive development through time and so on. And so I believe that there are a lot of small steps that we can do throughout the education level, and even more when we are at universities and we are the front line, of course, with the students. We need to be able to also attract then girls and women to IT and AI-related courses. So, for example, even in the courses that I teach at university, I actually had this like open assignment that they could do any AI-related project, something that would worry them and so on. And as was very well referenced here before, race, gender inequalities, these automated bots that learn the language that become violent and so on. These things, they actually worry our students. And so I believe that the awareness is already being created, which is very, very important. But to have this representation that our last speaker also talked about, we need then to try to deconstruct this idea that IT engineering and any kind of informatic-related work is for men, right? And I believe that nowadays that has been decreasing, but I can give the example that when I started my engineering course a long time ago, I think that we were almost 200 students at the computer engineering course, and we were only 8 girls. So it's like, it can be overwhelming. So we really need, like, from the very beginning to have this representation, because we need our students, and maybe even from high school or even before, to be able to give examples of how important it is to have this representation, this discussion, this awareness, even with our male colleagues and so on. So we start from the beginning creating awareness of how the lack of gender representation can impact the outcomes, and the modern AI, and we have also these black boxes, sometimes algorithms that sometimes we think about using them for image recognition, speech recognition, and so on. We have already a lot of challenges in AI. So we have all this field of explainable AI, ethics and AI, and so on. And if we don't have, of course, this female representation and even the underrepresented genders, of course, nowadays we also have to take that into account. I think that AI can probably be first used to identify problems and only after that start solving them. So we need to be careful, of course, on how we cannot blindly just use these algorithms because, and it was stressed already, we have like this all levels when designing a system like this. We have the modeling, we have the coding, we have then the deployment. So, and also we have all these other levels that we want to take from AI. So we want to have some new insights. We want to make decisions that have some kind of decision support system. And of course, we may want to predict outcomes, for example, as in health. And I can give, for example, my experience when I was working at the hospital, that when we start analyzing data, when we analyze, for example, the population as a whole, we may not be aware of some relations that may be rare in the population that are, for example, intrinsic females. So there are, of course, some co-occurrences of disease and so on that only occur in the female population. But the statistics that are applied and so on may hide all these effects. So even this data aggregation in some fields can be very, very important to be able to have a more knowledgeable system that can really support us in our decisions and so on. And so I think that in all these steps, we have the first step that women must be aware that they are needed to be able to construct these systems. We also need to then to create this awareness from the very beginning of our education, I believe, to be able to attract more women to the IT and engineering courses. And I think that we need to act in a way that we may provide a lot of resources. So it's awesome that we have also these associations as Women in AI, Women in Network Science, and so on, because AI may be embedded in other fields. For example, even in network science, we also use machine learning and sometimes some mechanism of AI. So we may be using the same purposes, the same technologies in fields that may have other names, but still in these fields we also have some kind of underrepresentation of female and also other genders. And so all that we have been discussing from the beginning, recommendation systems, policy making, health, and so on, we need, of course, to have all this representation. And I think that these mechanisms, these algorithms that we want already to have, of course, these very high efficacy results and so on, I believe that we can also use them to identify precisely where things are going wrong. So where is the data missing? Why don't we have? So before deploying these systems to the general use, because of course all the biases can be very complicated to control once they are implemented, and once we start seeing the consequences in real life, I believe that they can be helpful also to identify where the problems are, to be able to tackle them, of course. And so I think that, and I don't want to take much of your time, that in my role as a professor and also as a scientist, I think that, of course, we need more women each time more to be part of the process of creating all these models, all this coding, or at least be part of a multidisciplinary team that takes all these different cognitive perspectives. But I think that this really needs to start also from very early ages, changing maybe a little bit how we perceive the world that is not like male default. So as we grow up, we are also able to have like a more critical spirit to also be able to say, okay, this is, we need like a more diverse setting, a more diverse data, or identify at least where are we lacking, where are we not present in terms of collecting data to be able to deploy trustable AI systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Teixeira. You raise some important and interesting topics, indeed. So I'm going to give the chance again to our participants to send us questions, to take the floor in order to make suggestions, to make comments. If not, we have one on my own. But Maria is prepared again, so we are going to change the turn in this moment. So you have the floor, Maria.
Obrigada. Obrigada pela participação. Duas palavras.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
I have two questions for you. I think there is no translation into Portuguese. You refer data gap, or gender gap in data. That's very interesting expression. What kind of data, in what specific aspects would you need for your research? For instance, from your experience at the hospital, what kind of data would be useful to improve health service delivery with a gender perspective? It's my first question. And my second question, you mentioned that there is a structural embedded lack of gender equality from the beginning of our lives. Of course, I agree. Education, as you said, is crucial here. In your personal experience, what works to bring more women into AI and digital fields? Thank you very much.
In terms of gender perspective in health, I've been recently working with this with a couple of students in the sense of exploring the data in terms of, sometimes in AI, we collect the data from a population and then we just like calculate some statistics, we put in some kind of machine learning or something, and try to get some predictions or at least some kind of group aggregation of similar patients, for example, just to give a couple of very simple examples. And what happens is that when we don't deaggregate by gender, so when we are not sensitive to particularities that are documented to occur only in women, we lose the sensitivity in the data. So we are not able to maybe identify some interactions between, for example, diseases or some pathways at the hospital and so on, because and I don't want to enter into much math details, but how also some statistical
The details are important for us.
No, it's just because some statistical tools, they take into account like the size of a population with a given trait, what is the subpopulation that also shares another trait, and so on. And when we run by statistical tests that will give us with some confidence, how can we trust the results that we are observing, not having enough representation, or if they are diluted in a bigger population that is very diverse, and when we join sometimes then the males and females, when we observe the final results of these algorithms, we lose the sensitivity that only are present in women. For example, we were studying a population of migraine, and when we aggregated all the population, we saw some interactions then that were the most common in the population, like anxiety and other disorders. And for example, in this entire population study, we wouldn't observe, for example, endometriosis and other female more specific syndromes and disease, that we can only observe these very strong correlations or this very strong impact when we deaggregate the data. So when we separate female population from the male population. So what I think that, for example, in health, trying to predict some kind of evolution or even some progression in neurodegenerative diseases and so on, that can have different traits between the different genders, we need to have this, to be careful with this, like to observe, okay, if I have my entire population and I run these algorithms, I have these results, but what happens now if I deaggregate by gender? And I think that we can only have some more trust in deploying some systems, mainly also in health, because we need to be very careful with that, if we are aware of the differences when we deaggregate genders and what is interesting to women and what is interesting to men. And I think that in health, a gender perspective and to provide a better care and so on, we really need to not just mix everyone. Of course, we can have patients that are similar despite the gender, but for many conditions, we could have some interactions that could be hidden if we don't be careful in analyzing then the aggregated data by gender. I don't know if I replied well, but I think that this gender perspective is more like curating the data, not only before the analysis, but also after the analysis, and be aware of what we are maybe covering if we are not careful enough when we treat the data before applying the algorithms. Regarding the education and bringing more women to IT and engineering, I think that, for example, the awareness that we are able to create maybe already from the primary school and so on is precisely that. I think that there are some cognitive settings that we are not very conscious from very young age that are related to the fact that if when I'm learning a language, when I'm learning math or something, I have examples that John is the engineer and Maria is the nurse or something like that, that will create already some cognitive biases from the beginning. So I know that I'm talking a very low level, but I think that if we work from the beginning to also have some diversification in the examples that we give on textbooks from the beginning, and then of course when we are growing up and approaching high school, that we don't have like computers is for boys and whatever else is for girls. I think that girls and women will not have already that barrier, that mental barrier, like maybe computers are not for me, engineering are not for me, because I don't think that women don't want to go there, but I think that sometimes they think they don't belong there. And for example, in high school, I was the only girl in my class of 30 students, so it was not easy. And I think that we need to at least facilitate this process for them. And of course, the more women we have growing up, going to IT courses, it will be also easier. And I think that from the moment that they are aware, okay, if there is a problem and I can be part of the solution by going this way, I think that naturally that interest will come. So I know, of course, that workshops and women days are completely important nowadays, while we don't have this restructuring from the very young age in which we deconstruct these male and female jobs that unfortunately, I believe they still exist.
Thank you. I'd like to keep this last issue on and up. So I'm going to ask you about. I don't know if this Parliament last year has a resolution on closing the digital gender gap, women's participation in the digital economy. In this, the European Parliament called on educational entities to include, and I read out loud, include a gender component is in all STEM and ICT-related curricula, educational materials, and teaching practices from an early age to encourage girls to take up studying mathematics, coding, ICT classes, and science subjects in schools. How can all this be done in practice? Do you know of some best practices? What would be your recommendations on this topic?
Well, of course, one of the suggestions would be, of course, as I was saying a little bit before, revising the examples in textbooks and so on, starting like that, like what children and teenagers are exposed to when they are studying. And the other thing is, I know that, for example, in Portugal, I think there is at least one small academy in Porto for schools like the second and third cycles or so to code and so on, that they try to bring students to also be part of that, including, of course, girls and so on. I think that the main issue here is that, of course, we can create infrastructures, but it has to start also, of course, in the mental settings. And I think it could take a while because we need parents to be actively also deconstructing all these mental constructs that they exist. So in terms of education, it's awesome that is already, of course, written and it's a plan. And I believe that the creation of these infrastructures and providing, of course, more resources to young people to have access to coding and to learn about this is important. But I believe it has to be like 100% also creating awareness with the parents, with the educational system for sure. I think that when we are teaching, for example, coding, and when we start bringing people and women to the IT, we also need to already probably start giving examples of what happens if we have some kind of representation in the data or not. Because even with small examples, and this has to be, of course, very well worked with the educators, we maybe can create examples that for them are accessible, even, for example, with sports or with other cartoons, that we may then observe different outcomes if we haven't take into account only part of this representation or part of that representation. So I believe that even though, of course, the educational infrastructures will have a tremendous impact, we also need all these different levels to work together. So it's not an easy answer for sure.
Thank you very much for your explanations. So I'm going to turn to the next speaker, that is Sara Mateos, expert in public administration in the field of equality policies. She's an author of the Spanish white paper on women in technology, now working as the equality advisor of the Socialist Group in the Spanish Parliament. Ms. Mateos graduated in Political Administration Sciences in 2005, Certificate of European Political Studies by the Institute of Political Studies of Strasbourg, with a Diploma of Advanced Studies in Feminist Perspective as Critical Theory, with research on normative femininity, political subject and citizenship. She holds a Master in Public Equality Policies. In 2012, she won the Carmen de Burgos SI Prize. With extensive experience in public administration and in the field of equality policies, she has worked in various technical and managerial positions and as an external consultant. She has published various studies, the most recent being the White Paper on Women in Technology, carried out by the Secretary of State for the Digital Advancement of the Ministry of Economy in Spain of 2018. She has been an advisor in the cabinet of the Vice President of the Government and the Minister of the Presidency between 2018 to 2021. She is currently an advisor to the Equality Commission in the Congress of Deputies of the Socialist Parliamentary Group. So I'm going to give her the floor. Ms. Mateos, la palabra es suya desde.
The floor is yours from now on, madam. And thank you for being here this afternoon.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And congratulations to you for this initiative and for this cycle of events that you've organized to really delve into this extremely exciting and complex subject that is AI. Now, I saw that the other speakers presented things that I would have presented, so I won't repeat them, but I did want to just add to what they said and look specifically at some points. When it comes to women and AI, you have to look at it from different angles. First and foremost, skilling and acquiring of those skills. And in fact, in the European Union, we know that the Commission is placing great emphasis on this, as well as on the use of technology and inclusion of women, and also the way that algorithms impact them, and the biased algorithms that can have an impact on people's lives offline. So it doesn't impact just online events, but the unconscious bias can infect offline life. And in addition to that, I'd like to look at a few points related to the gender aspect. Representation is something that is so incredibly important. It really broadens and enriches teams. And when it comes to equality, and we have to be able to address that, but we need to have the technical and specific understanding of gender equality, not just having a sensitivity to it. That means, like anywhere else, we need to have theoretical and technical criteria. That means that we can actually apply gender equality. It's not just a question of goodwill. In addition to that, and align with that, we are working on legislation you're working on legislation that will affect the member states. And what have we seen in terms of the drafting of legislation and gender equality? What we've seen is that good intentions are excellent, but what we need is for them to actually become reality. Because if it does not become reality, then we can have the best legislation in place stating that women and men are going to be on an equal footing, but then that doesn't take place necessarily, and it's really hard to actually implement it. So you're addressing the issue of having regulations that would be in direct contact with gender equality regulations, and how that we would be able to have this network of regulators making sure that they are sharing their best practices experience in this area. Now, when we talk about gender equality, it seems that we're always starting from scratch. When we look at, for example, women and AI and their role in it professionally, we know that women will be able to bring much to the equation. But the gender equality policy has been developed over the course of recent years, so there needs to be a new focus then to get more into the nitty-gritty of the subject. The digital transformation is not an option. It is happening at a breakneck speed, and since, and in fact, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and digital is now impacting every aspect of our daily lives, from the way we interact with institutions, academia, among in our personal relations, and that's really overhauling our lives in every way. If we look at the data, we can see that there is scarce representation of women in the digital area, and not just in terms of their presence in jobs, but also in terms of the purchase. So we need more women, of course, in jobs, in the labor market, but also we have to see their activity on a personal level in terms of how they're using AI when it comes to, for example, banking, the way that they maintain relations with their family and friends. And this is going to be impacted as well via AI. That's why it's important to have that specific view of the involvement of women in all of this. And indeed, 100% avail of the talent of women in developing all of this. How can we do this? Let's look at a lot of the key points. We know that there is this gender gap in the digital area. Now, this is something that we can see suddenly. It's not something that just happened overnight, but it's something that happened over the course of a long progression. And so we need to look at what elements feed into this process, meaning that digital gap exists on a gender level. And one of that aspects is the role of women and the fact that there aren't enough women in the digital field. Moreover, there are stereotypes, and this is something that happens from the very youngest age, and that has a determining impact on the way that women get involved, and in fact also the way that we approach the digital interests and the way that is developed. This contributes to the fact that there are a compounding fact in fact of the fewer women that are involved in the digital means that fewer women get involved in the digital field because of those stereotypes. For example, there's this idea that to be able to be involved in STEM subjects, well, you have to be extremely intelligent, you have to be a man, and there are studies that show that this is the case. A study was carried out that had huge repercussions, and it really flagged up the fact that as of 6 years of age, girls felt that they were as smart as boys, but from 6 years of age on, they thought that they were not as smart as the boys in their class. The role of stereotypes, therefore, really reinforces prejudice, and in terms of how girls perceive themselves, what they think about their own skills, and then what they wind up doing. Another key point is terms of scientific study. For example, going all the way back to high school and university studies, what we can see is that in studies, they show that at the elementary level, it's really at that point where girls develop their scientific vocation. And then there's the issue of bias. That happens also with teachers. Teachers pass on that bias in the way that they are showing the subjects and talking about them, and the way that they are even teaching various subjects in the curriculum, and the way that they ask questions to girls, and the way that they grade the girls' tests. And we can see that bias already exists there, and there's a huge gender bias that has an impact on the way that is broached, and that then can disincentivize girls from getting involved in the science, technology, and mathematics subjects. Then there's the issue of perfecting one's skills. Usually we say girls are better at language, boys are better at math. All of this is something that piles up over the course in the way that we develop and become. and it influences us. So we hear people say to girls, well, it would be hard for you to be in engineering or in technology because that's going to be very hard for you, young lady. You should perhaps think about something else. So this is something really that is a constant. And it's not just a reference, but there are things that are being done to try to dispel these stereotypes in, for example, school books, in teaching tools where they're trying to represent girls and boys, men and women differently. So that will influence not only how girls and women understand the subject matter, but also the role models that they look up to. And they will look at also the sector as one that is as accessible to them. It really will shift the perception, because it's important for girls and women to be able to relate, to see themselves and feel that they're included and that it makes sense for them to be there, so that they can see a space for themselves within the technological realms. And that's something that is, if they don't feel that, they can have imposter syndrome, and then they are not able to develop in the technological subject matters. That's something that happens frequently. Another one of the fundamental elements in this process, as we were saying, something that also influences, because we know that it's important for women to be involved in designing and developing of algorithms, to be able to rise to this challenge. How are we going to be able to factor in the gender aspect in algorithms? Three things. The first is the way that we design the algorithm, where there is a human touch. It's very probable at that point that a bias could be included. The second is how we learn from that bias, where it comes from, and the third, and how we can correct that. And the third is how this impacts offline life, i.e., in the tangible realm, in our tangible lives. So perhaps this can have an impact, for example, whether or not you can get a mortgage to buy a house, or if you can get a line of credit. Algorithms have an impact on this. And that also has an impact on selection in human resources and in recruitment. That has a direct impact on our daily lives, on our hopes and on our dreams, and our ability to have personal development. Moreover, and last but not least, the technological industry is not just a business, but it's becoming also the driving force of culture. And so it has a huge role to play in terms of the perception of the world that we live in and how we learn. And that's how we learn behaviors, both on and offline. If we look at the information that is being provided, if it's being generated by AI with a scientific neutrality, we have to make sure that those algorithms, therefore, are fully neutral. And it will make it harder. If we believe that, it'll be harder for us to single out those biases that exist and that continue to persist. So perhaps one last thing. It's always important to have professionals, of course, and we can't just have good intentions. And when it comes to gender equality, we have to be able to design all of this AI with the gender aspects included in the factoring, and look at what limits that full gender equality, and making sure that we don't limit the aspirations of girls and women. That shouldn't be considered a small element, because it's really more important than that. It means that we're not harnessing everyone's talent in the way that we should. And I think also Ms. Micheli, who is one of the biggest thinkers in illustrated feminism, what we've seen in the digital illustration in feminism is born in illustration, a response to the fact that there are rights that are universal, and it's a demand of women to have the same rights recognized and to be able to fill in any of those gaps, any of those problems that existed in our society in the pre-digital phase. Well, they should not be reproduced in the digital era. So since I mentioned this great thinker, and one of the most important ones that was another one who is another important thinker who contributed to the thought process, when we look at the limitations of that produce stereotypes, I'd like to just conclude with Simone de Beauvoir's words, saying that we have to consider our individuality as an individual. Nothing limits us, nothing defines us, nothing subjects us, and our ability should be precisely what it is in the instant. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Hardly the screen, so I don't know if there's anybody interested to make a question. But Maria, you were interested, you told me, so you have the floor now.
Yes, thank you. Gracias, Sara, por todo que has compartido.
Thank you, Sarah, for everything that you've shared with us, your experience. You mentioned that it's important for us to explore not just the presence of women in AI, but also to look at precisely how women in general use AI technology, which is another way of looking at it. Could you perhaps give us a few more words on how you would differentiate between these two things? What the various patterns are that you see in terms of the use of AI by men, and how that differentiates from the way that AI is used by women. Thank you.
Bueno,
Yes. When it comes to digital, we shouldn't look just at how we use things, but when and how much. And the most recent data shows us that has been published by the European Commission. It focuses just not only on the fact that women use technology less, but they use it differently for different things. For example, very much linked to what we've already said here this afternoon, the fact that there is, when it comes to programming, to exploring exactly what technology is. If we look at it like a box, there's really a tendency that women or girls think that they aren't capable, whereas boys explore it more. They would open this box and look around. And women use it more on a daily basis in terms of the way that they manage their daily life, shopping, study, banks, and not exactly how the applications are designed, how they work. And so it's that kind of thing specifically. And also the actual use of technology and games and video games. That is a paradigm really in terms of how we could analyze this. And then that has a repercussion on people's capability and how they're able to develop that. So for example, if you feel very agile in your ability to use all of these games and technologies, then you're perhaps more keen to use them in your professional life and elsewhere. And if you don't, then the opposite will happen. And also what we commented on was that if on a daily basis there is a lack of use of digital tools, the risk is that an individual will be excluded, not just in terms of developing AI, but also exclusion from a person's daily life, because the digital aspects will touch on everything, and women would run the risk of being completely left aside.
Una pequena nota.
One more comment. Do you think women are less sensitive to issues of cybersecurity than men are?
No creo que las
No. Generally, I don't think women are more or less sensitive. I believe, however, that the technological interest has a huge impact. If you have, you don't have a lot of women involved in cybersecurity, not because women aren't interested or capable in security, but because they have been told that that isn't an area for them to be involved. Sophia mentioned that, for example. Well, that's not really an area where I should work. This isn't something that is in line with what I can do. And we hear this a lot. When we were drafting that white paper on women in technology for the ministry, what we saw was that there were a lot of women in university and engineers and in technology. And when I listened to them, I was so surprised that we could still hear these types of comments. A young woman spoke, very young, 18, 19, 20. Someone asked her if she thought about studying engineering, and she said, well, perhaps it would be, but perhaps, and she was counseled not to do it because it might be difficult for her, and she should perhaps choose another course. So this isn't something that is done on purpose. The purpose is not to discriminate. It's something that is so incredibly embedded in us, and we just have to be conscious of the fact that it exists and that this equality then perpetuates itself. And so using professionals that look just at that and how you can address all of these issues and correct them is so important to have that sense. It's not a question of just being sensitive to a subject. It's also having the technical capability to be involved in the area. Because if you have the best possible intentions, but you might just continue to reproduce the same stereotypes, that will limit the involvement of women in these areas. Thank you.
María, tienes tan buen
Maria, your Spanish is so good. We would say you were from Leon almost. More like Leon. The best Spanish that from the Spanish peninsula. Well, I would perhaps just conclude by putting a very concrete question. It's true that as we really look at the legislative development in the digital area in the EU, and more concretely than just AI, what we can see is that there's an increasing need for multidisciplinary teams, as we're doing now. So experts, men and women, that are experts in various areas. So not people with general knowledge, for example, in a gender bias, and then bring their knowledge that they can share. And technology, of course, gives us an enormous opportunity to be able to make even more progress in balancing this imbalance that exists. But on the other hand, what we know that there is also a risk of a compounding of bias, and where there will be even more inequality, whereas we would like to correct that. So my question really would be, are there technological companies, administrations, governments that are working specifically in that area, that are working with multidisciplinary teams, with specialists also in gender policy, people that are spread throughout Europe? Some countries are very advanced, others less. So what are the best practices, for example, that exist and that could be used by us as a guide and as a way forward in the way that we approach this?
prácticas.
Thank you very much. Well, when it comes to best practices, in the white paper, we have several chapters, And in each chapter, we have a summary of best practices on every single subject. So this is a new subject that we're starting to really focus on in Spain, with the adoption of the science law that is going to adopt a number of these elements, and it's something that is then going to be integrated into various bodies. There's more interest now being paid to this. And what we can see that gender equality and the role of that is not always well defined, because sometimes there's a great conflation of various things in these bodies. Good practices, best practices, in terms of how can you design good algorithms with the gender perspective. Well, I know that there are projects to get more women involved in IT and in computers, but I think, as far as I know, we are more at this stage looking at how we're building this, and that if we can define the structures and the bodies that we have and what type of approach will we have to this gender equality in this area. So it's really more in an early phase. I don't know if I answered your question well, and I do apologize if I didn't.
Gracias.
No, it was excellent answer. Thank you very much for your speech, for your questions, and for the answers to the questions. So more the answers to the questions than the questions themselves. I'm not sure if anyone else would like to raise a question. If not, we will move to the next speaker. Whatever the case may be, we will have time at the end of our event to ask further questions. And keep in mind that if any of the guests would like to ask questions of other guests, they're more than welcome to do so we can get more information from each other as well.
To turn to our last speaker, that is Ivana Bartoletti, that is the founder of the Woman Leading in AI. She's internationally recognized thought leader in the fields of privacy, data protection, and responsible technology. Ivana has many years of experience working for large organizations in privacy policy, strategy, and programs related to digital transformation, cloud, and automation. The Cybersecurity Awards named her Woman of the Year 2019. As a visiting policy fellow at the University of Oxford, her research focuses on how to advance the global sharing of information in the context of privacy, security, data protection, and human rights. Ivana is co-editor of the AI book, a handbook for investors, entrepreneurs, and fintech visionaries, and is author of An Artificial Revolution on Power, Politics, and AI. She is founder of the influential Women Leading in AI network, a sought-after subject expert. Ivana is interviewed frequently in the mainstream media and speaks at many international events. An interview about her book is available here. I had the real pleasure to speak, to exchange thoughts with Ivana, and to be attendant of some of her addresses. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for being part of this panel. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am absolutely delighted to be here, and great to listen to the previous panelists. It was really, really interesting. I want to address two separate things. The first one is I want to address the issue that has been raised a lot around the harms of from a gender perspective. And then I want to focus on the current discussion around regulation that we're having. And I would like to throw some ideas for the S&D group of what I think is important for us to focus on, for you to focus on at the moment. I speak here as somebody who works in this field, especially from a privacy standpoint, but I also speak as somebody who has been the chair of the Fabian Society in the past, and therefore shares a strong appreciation for policy. I really want to start with just a little bit of what was said earlier, but with hopefully bringing a different perspective. So we said, we've said it a lot. AI brings a lot of opportunities in our societies and across medicine and engineering and many different sectors. However, alongside all these amazing things, we've also seen the risks of coding existing stereotypes, perpetuating existing inequalities in society, and automating them. This is the risk that is very strong for women and especially for women of color. And the harms that we're seeing here, they're both individual harms and group harms. When it comes to the individual, we've been talking about this quite a lot earlier. So we are talking of algorithms that need to be fed data not to be neutral, because data is just the mirror of society, it's a picture. And therefore, in coding existing data, which are representative of society, into algorithms that increasingly have an editorial function. So they decide what we are exposed to when we browse the internet. They edit and curate the reality that we are exposed to. They have an allocative function, because increasingly algorithms decide whether we are allocated a particular service, whether it's a loan, whether it's a housing, and increasingly have a predictive power, these algorithms, which is the power to predict behavior. And for example, in the cases of local authorities or government, to allocate resources, thus making policy decisions based on data, which is not neutral, but is mirror society and mirror of centuries, millenniums of unequal opportunities. Therefore, the first issue here is that we, I think, have to recognize that the mantra they've been following over the last decades, which is the mantra of data, that data can give us the best opportunities, we must follow the data. Yes, data is really important, but data cannot be taken in a critical way, because data is simply a picture of society as it is. So if we take data in a not critical way, we ingest it and feed it into these machines, making decisions about tomorrow. We are delegating the past to make decisions around the future. And this is not something that progressive politics should be about. Even data collection is never a neutral exercise. Collecting data about individuals means that you are elevating somebody to be in a database, while deciding that some other people cannot be in a database. This, for example, means that collecting more data in poorer areas will show, for example, that the crime is higher in those areas, but not because the crime is actually higher, but because there's more surveillance and more collection about this. The reason why I'm saying all this, because the first point that is really important is to underpin the way that we want to shape the future of big data, artificial intelligence, has to be rooted in what we believe in society. Encoding the past into the future is not something that should be the ambition of who wants to see the future better than it was. That is my first point. My second point is that it's not just the individuals being locked out of services, but it's also the group of people. And by group, I don't mean static group. I mean in group depending on circumstances. I'll give you an example. We know that online, job adverts that pay less are often served to women, because traditionally, and we go back to what I was saying earlier, women have earned less than men. We know that in order to maximize the efficiency of people clicking an advert, that advert needs to be successful with a particular segment of the population. This means, for example, that if I am a company and I'm selling products for the house, or I'm selling things about babies, I will serve this advert to women because traditionally women clean the house more than men and look after the kids more than men. But by doing so, I am just perpetuating the stereotypes. And by perpetuating the stereotypes, I am actually making it more subtle, more difficult for people to resist to, but also I'm also translating it into escalating into prejudice and making it more serious. So the first bit that I wanted to say is we really need to root our analysis and our understanding of this into the values that drive us as individuals and as a collective, in this case, you as a political group. The other issue here is to bear very much in mind that if we are critical of some of the potential risks of this tool, it's not because we're critical of the technology. It's because we love the technology to the point so much that we want it to benefit everyone. Especially in a situation we're in, where the dividend of the digital world and the have been distributed very unequally over the last decades. Then I want to briefly talk about what we can do. Having more women in technology is very important, but it's not enough. And I would be very worried if we were only focusing on women in tech, which is a crucial thing that we must achieve. And I have founded a group of women, network of women globally, who are in artificial intelligence. Focusing on women in tech is a good thing. But the women in technology is very much related to much wider issues. Years ago, in the 40s, being in coding was a female thing. Women were in coding. It was like being a secretary. It was considered like knitting. So women were automatically seen as more suited to coding. It all changed when in the 60s or 70s, it became cool to be a coder because data became very much of an economic power. And instead of the knitters, the coders, the female coders, the images around data and coding and AI were of men suited and booted. What I'm trying to say is that the issue of women in technology is very much reflects wider issues. So we do have and we do need more women in tech. That is absolutely important. And we cannot wait until we form a new generation for doing so. We need to get into technologies, women who have returned to work after maternity leave. We have to encourage organizations, like so many are doing, to ensure that we retrain women at any point of life. We can't wait until we change the situations from the schools. But that won't cut it. Because artificial intelligence is far more than technology. Artificial intelligence is very much about power of reshaping the way we live, not just in Europe, but globally, as we are seeing. Artificial intelligence is very much of a race and this is why we are putting in place in Europe, for example, as you know much more than me, obviously, a whole deal of packages around sovereignty across different levels. So what is really, really important for women from a gender perspective is to look at how we get more women into the policies, more women into shaping the norms and rules governing artificial intelligence moving forward, as well as more women and company boards making the decisions around what artificial intelligence is used for. At the moment, there is a European AI Act, which is being discussed. And I do believe that there are some issues within the way that we want to regulate, and in European Parliament, you want to regulate artificial intelligence, they need to be addressed from a gender perspective. The first issue is around the definition of AI. I am very scared the idea of reducing AI to simply machine learning. The reason why I'm saying this is because for women, there are so many AI systems that we are using that would fall out of that definition that would be dramatic for our lives. Then the second issue is we are addressing in Europe, there is the sort of, it's great as we've done, with the General Data Protection Regulation. We've been sort of leading in the field, and I am proud of being in the European Union and with General Data Protection Regulation, which has been a flagship regulation, which is a lot of countries have been following. The European AI Act has the potential to do the same and to help shape the norms around AI at a time where there is a lot of where AI has been exploited for so much good, but it could do so much harm. And we in the European AI Act, we talk about conformity assessments for high-risk AI. And I ask, the definition of high risk, has it been proved from a gender perspective? The idea that the conformity assessments, for example, are self-assessed. So, for example, issues around bias, issues around discrimination in systems, there has to be an assessment done by the organization that due process has been followed. Now, that is fine. And that is good that due process has been followed. The due diligence is essential. But I always wonder whether we need something more to safeguard women and minorities in the age of AI. Do we need something that is more accountable? Something that is not left to businesses by themselves, but is more accountable? The other thing that I wanted to say is that sometimes we say, well, with artificial intelligence, we just need to have a human in the loop. And again, this is where I would like to see women, and not just women, those who support us, say, well, I don't trust the human in the loop either. It can't be the silver bullet to all the problems of algorithmic decision-making that we have. Because it depends on how this is used. And the last thing is around redress. What is happening when we as women, we get discriminated by an AI system? What is the redress that we get? How do we encourage a stronger civic participation of women in this field if we don't have redress available to those women who have been discriminated by an AI system? So we do have an opportunity around the European AI Act, I feel. And I feel this is to look at whether from a gender perspective, this is sufficient, is good enough, and I think it's really important that we do that. I want to close on one thing, and that is the fact that around the debate around artificial intelligence is often very polarized. So on the one hand, and as soon as you start to express some criticism, you've been told, that you are anti-innovation, that you don't want to you want to stop Europe or a country from growing because other countries like China, like the US, they do much more, and which is we do live in a globalized world with all these sort of difficulties that we are in at the moment. But there is one element, which is the element of trust that we talk a lot about, at the moment we live in a big consumer distrust and on sort of big technologies and big tech and I think there is an opportunity now to ensure that we create that trust after so much damage has been done over recent years around misuse of data, misuse of technology. And we are in this when we hear things like, oh, people don't care about this, don't care about that because they still use these platforms. It's not true. It's because they don't have an alternative for doing that. So if we want to be a flourishing space in Europe with startups, larger companies, we need users and citizens to trust. And women have a big say into this. So we are talking about the perspective of a huge part of our population and winning the trust of a huge part of the population. So this is why we have, I think, to really have the courage to say, what do we need to do to achieve that trust? What is meaningful transparency around artificial intelligence? What is the redress that we're offering people? And how do we make sure that this technology really benefits women and does not leave us behind?
Thank you very much, Ms. Bartoletti. I don't know if there's anyone that could have a question. I can't see. So I don't know if you, Maria, are interested. Okay. So this is my turn. this moment. So thank you very much, Ivana. I assure you, first of all, that we, S&D Group, and myself, are striving very hard in order not to narrow the concept of artificial intelligence, because you know very well, better than us, even better than us, that there's a high pressure in this aim. So we are trying to stand firmly. And even trying to craft better the concept itself, just to make it to be a big umbrella to comprehend all the reality. And just as a matter of question, you mentioned our regulation, the efforts and the initiatives that some of them that we, the European Union, are taking into account and are trying to come forward. But I'd like to ask you about the directive of work-life balance. What is your opinion on this topic? Because when we speak about gender equality in AI and in the digital sector in general, an important aspect is this work-life balance. Bottom line, we are talking about mainly of teleworking, and we know very well what were the effects on the gender, from the perspective of gender, of this teleworking in last hard part of pandemic pandemic time. So do you think that the EU is doing enough or more should be done in order to improve the work-life balance conditions, which would make it easier for women to enter into STEM, ICT and AI careers? And in addition, I'm going to take advantage of the debate that we have in this moment about the Women on Boards, at last, the Women on Boards directive. I don't know if you think that we are in the right track in this directive of. I know very well that we have to take advantage of this debate just in order to deliver lastly this directive. But do you think that is enough for this moment? I know that everything is susceptible of improvement, but do you think that is enough in this moment to approve this directive?
Turning it off. Okay, thank you. Work-life balance is a big topic because especially, over the last 2 years has been pretty dramatic for women. And this is yet another of the big sort of paradoxes about technology. Yeah. So, if you think about it, when it comes to technology, now we can do everything online. I can be doing this and then I can go on my phone and order dinner and get sort of delivery, or I can organize my daughter's birthday online, and I can do everything. But in all women, we can do this. And then we think about, has this really made our life easier? Or hasn't technology and these tools simply piled on more pressure on women, so they have to be even more Wonder Women than they used to be before? This is a really good question that we've got to ask ourselves in terms of, is this technology, which is not neutral, technology cannot be neutral, is technology making women's life easier or not? And we've got to have the courage to say when it's not. And the fact that we have been sold a vision, for example, that is great to be working from home, that is great to be doing teleworking, that is great to be, it depends. And we should perhaps look at what is the real impact on women, especially from an intersectional standpoint. If I look, for example, at the output from an academic perspective, during the first year of the pandemic, the academic output from female academics plummeted because of the responsibilities that women had at home. And now I feel that there is a strong sense for workers across the different countries to look at, for example, the right to disconnect. The idea that, you have the right to disconnect from work, and is something that you have. I do think that on the other hand, working from home and working remotely has helped women, and this is both more scientific evidence and also some more anecdotal that I see in my working life, or women, for example, who have caring responsibilities, or women who have never benefited from the presenteeism culture, or a work of to be more active in the workplace. So it's a mixed picture, I think, and we need to. I would very much like to really look at this in a much profound way that we've done so far. I also have to add that one thing that is putting a lot of pressure on men and women in work is the use of surveillance technologies in the workplace, which have become very intrusive, especially during the pandemic. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done in relation to this. And sometimes, over the last few years, we have come across some of these technologies not because there's been enough transparency around those, But we've come across these technologies thanks to this loud and courageous voice of people within companies, and they've put forward what has been happening. So I think there is a variety of issues that we need to look at in here. And I think it's really important when it comes to women in STEM. Obviously, I mean, we've heard a lot about the culture of Silicon Valley and what happens, and the culture of so obviously the issue around time is more important than ever. And around boards, I think it is a good direction of travel. And I think it's important to pursue that. And it's not just a matter of it is a matter of representation, has been mentioned. It is a matter of having really important role models for women from younger generation to look at. And it's also, I think, very important to look at a more, especially now that we're deciding what to use artificial intelligence for, where to use it, when we need to make decisions around artificial intelligence, not because it's cool, not because it looks very good in the market, but because it's effective, it solves a problem for a business and organization. This is where we need a very diverse board in order to make more effective decisions around this.
Everything was so interesting. Thank you very much, Ivana, for your participation. I look forward to count on you next acts that we could support from the S&D group. Thank you very much. So we are running out of time. I'm going to give the floor now to Maria in order to close with final remarks. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iva. First, I want to thank all the speakers who joined us here today to debate such an important topic, and also, of course, to thank our Secretariat for all their support during our work on this committee and to this event organization. As Ivan said, this is the last webinar organized by our political group, the Socialists and Democrats, in the context of the committee, Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence. In all previous webinars, for example, on digital literacy, on AI and labor market, we have always brought in a gender perspective. However, I think it shows, this event, how important gender equality is for our group, that we finish this webinar series by focusing special on this topic. As Irache mentioned, our leader, the digital revolution will only be fair if it contributes to gender equality. However, in the present, as we heard today, there are many challenges. For example, Mrs. Carlian Schill mentioned how AI systems can be biased against women working in platform work. And Sofia Teixeira mentioned how the lack of disaggregated data in the health might lead to algorithms discarding problems that affect mostly women. And Sara Mateus also mentioned how stereotypes in our society reinforce prejudices about women's roles and influence their professional choices. And finally, Ivana mentioned how important it is to have a critical approach on data. Data are not neutral, and automated decisions can perpetuate stereotypes. We need technology for a better balanced world, not for the contrary. Having said this, I want to finish on a positive note by highlighting some benefits that AI can bring to women. First, AI and data analytics can help understand complex problems that affect mostly women, such as online hate speech and cyber violence. These technologies can be used to explore conversation patterns on online platforms such as Twitter. Through this, we can analyze how online hate speech against women spreads with, for example, the use of bots and fake accounts. Information such as this is essential so that platforms and policymakers can know how to put in place effective solutions against this new phenomenon. And second, AI can replace humans in situations where there is often conscious or unconscious bias against certain groups, such as women. For example, AI can support companies in analyze applicants for a certain job. In recruitment processes, men are often biased, even unconsciously, against women, especially those in childbearing age. By using AI in recruitment processes, we could make sure that hiring decisions are based on objective and predefined criteria and therefore reduce the potential for bias against women. In order to assure that AI is used for the benefit of women, as Iracha also mentioned, we need to make sure that women are represented at all stages of development of AI algorithms. It's not enough, but it's important. However, in the world, it is estimated that only 22% of AI professionals are women. So we need to work to improve this representation. For example, in Portugal, we have a project called Engineers for One Day that aims to promote engineer careers to middle and high school students. We need to scale up this kind of project, this good practice, and implement similar initiatives in all member states. In closing, I want to thank again our speakers, the audience that followed us online, as well as S&D AIDA for organizing this event. The digital transition is coming fast, and it's our job to make sure that it does not forget half of the population. As Iben mentioned at the start, you can count on our political group to fight for a democratic model of AI which contributes to reduce inequalities such as those between men and women. Thank you very much.